All right, so I want to thank Brooke for the title. She helps me with the research on this, and she also came up with the title, which is, I don't know if you're a writer or whatever, but that's the most important part for me is finding the right title. Gazing at Medusa. So I'm going to rehearse this myth for you and kind of use it as a guide through this very dangerous territory. Medusa, which most people don't know this, I think, it was originally, her name means guardian or protectress. And she was originally beautiful. She has two sisters who are immortal. So, there's something going on there right from the beginning before anything happens to her. Pindar calls her beautiful Medusa, and there she is, the beautiful Medusa. You can see she has the hair, but it's not full of snakes like you're used to seeing. She was, for Ovid, so we hear about her mostly from Ovid and Pindar, she was the jealous aspiration of many suitors. She was a beautiful woman, born to two immortals related to the sea, and her sisters are immortal themselves, the other Gorgons. She was, however, violated. She was violated. And here is Hesiod, speaking of the violation in one way. Poseidon, he of the dark hair, lay with one of these Medusa, one of these sisters, one of the Gorgons, in a soft meadow among spring flowers. Oh, okay. Ovid, Medusa was violated in Athena's shrine by the Lord of the Sea. And Zeus's daughter Athena, this is very important, turned away. The goddess Athena turned away and covered with her shield her virgin's eyes. And then for fitting punishment, this is the myth, for fitting punishment to Medusa, she transformed the Gorgon's lovely hair into loathsome snakes. Ovid continues, as a bird, Medusa, the snake-tressed mother of the flying steed Pegasus, was seduced by Poseidon. Seeing herself transformed into such a repulsive creature, Medusa fled her home, never to return. Wandering about, abhorred, dreaded, shunned by the rest of the world, she turned into a character worthy of her outer appearance. In her despair, she fled to Africa, where, while wandering restlessly from place to place, young snakes dropped from her hair. That is how, according to the ancient ones, Africa became a hotbed of venomous reptiles. With the curse of Athena, the goddess, upon her, she turned into stone whomever she gazed upon, till at last, after a life of nameless misery, deliverance came to her in the shape of death at the hands of the man, the hero, Perseus. All this happened because a dishonorable king demanded that Perseus bring an impossible gift back to him, the head of Medusa. And what happens is Perseus, when he begins this hero's journey, when he begins this quest, he is aided by the gods because it is a holy quest. It is a society, the society of the time sanctions this quest. He must defeat Medusa. He needs the tools to defeat Medusa. And the gods, the whole realm of the gods come to his aid. They provide him with divine tools. And while the Gorgons, the sisters, slept, the hero attacked using Athena's shield, polished shield, to view the reflection of the Medusa's awful face. So he doesn't look at her directly, he looks at her in reflection. and thus avoids her petrifying gaze. And then he beheads her with something called a harp, an unbreakable sword. And as he does this, two creatures are born from her body, the winged horse Pegasus and the giant Chrysaor, who springs from her neck. Now, we don't hear anything more about Chrysaor, but I'm sure you've heard of Pegasus. In fact, Perseus is going to ride Pegasus to rescue Andromeda. So her sisters pursue Perseus with great fury. But remember, he's got the aid of the gods, so he not only has a shield, he has Hermes' winged boots and Hades' helmet of invisibility. But here's what's interesting. He turns Medusa's head into a weapon. Perseus had to keep her head. It was so powerful, he had to keep her head in a special sack. It's called a kubesis. And he had to keep it in the sack, but if he was in trouble, he would pull the head out and turn it to his enemies, who would turn, and that would turn them to stone. That's how he rescued Andromeda from a sea monster. And then he gives the head of Medusa to Athena to put on her shield. Pindar's, I said Pindar was the other source, his 12th ode recounts how the sisters' pursuit of Perseus went. After hearing their anguish and furious cries, Athena, who's a real interesting character in this story, was inspired. She heard the sisters' cries after Perseus beheads Medusa. And she says, I should invent the flute and try to repeat those cries of the sisters. And she does. But she saw her reflection while she was playing the flute, her face distended and ugly. And while she perfectly mimicked the sounds of the Gorgons, she also imitated their dreaded features. Just as Medusa exists in multiple types of stories in the mythological record, she's portrayed in numerous ways across the ancient world. Her appearance actually changes quite a bit, but this is not the appearance that's left to us. That one is Caravaggio's appearance of the screaming, snake-headed, decapitated Medusa. It is said, I believe this is right, that Caravaggio modeled it on his own features, by the way, which is interesting in itself. The point of Medusa, the symbolic and mythological point of Medusa is otherness, difference. She lives on the edge of the world, and Perseus must travel there to find her. She does not belong in society. Why not? Because she was the victim of a rape. I know this is insane logic. This is the mythological, not the logical. But and remember who does this. It's Athena, a goddess. The Gorgons themselves live outside of ordinary society, and so they're monsters already. Even though they're divine, especially the sisters, they're divine, they still are monstrous. And the etymology of the term monster is the same one that we use for demonstrate. It shows us something. The monster shows us something. Maybe the monster shows us ourselves in a reflection. But alterity, the otherness, this is Medusa. Yes, this is, by the way, there's a great article on Medusa from Madeline Glennon at the Met that shows her in ways I hadn't seen before. That's the Metropolitan Museum in New York. And one of the things she says here about Medusa that I didn't realize until I did this research is what she calls her striking frontality. And she's right, because if you look at depictions of persons In Greek art, they're not looking at you, but Medusa is looking at you. Her frontality, she's always facing you. What shall we do with this story? Well, I think we're going to talk about sex and gender and power. I think we're probably good talking about that in relation to Medusa, along with some other things. And to help us do that, I thought we would deal with two books, two really interesting books. One is called Making Sex, and one is called Making Gender. And they, I think, go right to the heart of this issue. So there's a lot to talk about here, obviously, with sex, gender, and power. And there's a lot of talking going on social media and elsewhere. But what we like to do here is go as deep as we can on these issues. There are plenty of people out there saying plenty of things on a certain level. We like to go to the heart of the matter if we can find it. And so that's what I hope to do tonight. Making Sex, Thomas LaCour, I think is subtitled Body and Gender from the Greeks to Freud. Okay? Thomas LaCour is a medical historian. He went to medical school and he got a history degree. And he begins his book with a story, which is always good. And let me tell you this story. The story begins when a young aristocrat, I love this part, whose family circumstances forced him into religious orders. Okay, so I guess they're poor, but, and this is like during the Renaissance. So he's a monk, but not by choosing, but by circumstance. He comes one day to a country inn. He found the innkeepers overwhelmed with grief at the death of their beautiful daughter. She was not to be buried until the next day, and the bereaved parents asked the young monk to keep watch over her body through the night. And he gladly acceded to this request. Reports of her beauty, however, made him wonder just how beautiful she was. He pulled back the death shroud, and instead of finding the corpse disfigured by the horrors of death, he found her features gracefully animated. The young man lost all restraint, forgot his vows, and took, quote, the same liberties with the dead that the sacraments of marriage would have permitted in life, unquote. Love how they talk back then. Ashamed of what he had done, the hapless necrophiliac monk departed hastily in the morning without waiting for the scheduled interment. When the time for the burial came, indeed, even as the coffin burying the dead girl was being lowered into the ground, someone felt movement coming from inside. The lid was torn off, the girl began to stir and recovered from what proved not to have been a real death at all, but only a coma. Needless to say, the parents were overjoyed to have their daughter back, although their pleasure was diminished when they realized that she was pregnant. Moreover, she could give no satisfactory account of how she had come to be that way. And in their embarrassment, the innkeepers sent her to a nunnery. I know. Hang on. Soon business brought the young aristocrat back into the area, oblivious of the consequences of his passion, but no longer in holy orders. So I want to know this guy's story, right, too, along with it. He left holy orders. He comes back to the scene of the crime. Once again, he finds the innkeepers in a state of consternation and quickly understands his part in their new misfortune. He runs to the convent and finds the object of his necrophilic desire, more beautiful alive than dead. And he asks for her hand, and with the sacrament of marriage, legitimize their child. Now, LaCour tells us this story to make 2 points. One is he wants to highlight two different interpretations of the story. So there is Antoine Louis in 1752. Apparently, this is a story that went around quite a bit in the Renaissance and later. He says this, he analyzes this story, and he says it's a simple case of fraud and conspiracy. Any decent scientist would have known that she was not dead, she was in a coma. Dr. Michael Ryan in 1836 finds a different issue, and he says, quote, here's what we learned from this, sorry, not to quote yet. Here's what we learned from this story, he says, quote, not only need a woman not feel pleasure to conceive, she need not even be conscious. 19th century. LaCour uses this story to mark the new understanding that women need not have orgasm to conceive. That was a new understanding. Thank you, Wendy. And in fact, the model up until this point for sex, for biological sex, the book is called Making Sex, was a one-sex model. Let me say that again. The understanding of human sexuality up until the 19th century, late 18th, early 19th century, was a one-sex model. The Bishop of Emesa in the 4th century put it this way: theirs are inside the body and not outside it. Theirs being women. Let me give you a little bit of doggerel from the time. Though they of different sexes be, yet on the whole they are the same as we. For those who have the strictest searchers been, find women are but men turned outside in. That was the model. In this world, again, up until the late 18th century, the vagina is an interior penis. The labia, foreskin. The uterus is a scrotum. The ovaries are testicles. You may have heard of Galen, a famous physician who's in 3rd century BC, who says that woman has testes with accompanying seminal ducts. Seminal ducts. Very much like a man's, one on each side of the uterus. The only difference being that the males are contained in the scrotum and the females are not. This is the much lauded Galen, an early physician. So, for 2 millennia, the ovary, an organ that by the early 19th century had become a synecdoche, it had become a primary symbol for woman, did not even have a name of its own. Galen refers to it by the same word he uses for testicles, orchaeus, from which we get the word orchid, allowing the context to make clear which sex he's concerned with. Herophilus had called the ovaries didymoi, which in Greek means twins, and refers to the testicles. He saw the fallopian tubes as sperm ducts that led from each testicle, growing much as these sperm ducts do in men's scrotum. Galen recognizes this error, so this wasn't, there was some disagreement within the one-sex model, but it was a one-sex model. There is no technical term in Latin or Greek or in the European vernaculars until around 1700 for the vagina as a tube or sheath, which is what it means, into which its opposite, the penis, fits. and through which the infant is born. There is no term in existence. Let me make sure you're getting this. For 2 millennia, the Western world considered women as men. They were inverted men. Now you say, well, why would they be inverted? Well, the answer is heat. Of course, women are colder than men. Women are basically mutated men because they're not hot enough. And in fact, there are stories like the young aristocrat story going around of children playing around puberty, by the way, little girls playing and getting too hot. There's a story of Foucault tells this story of a young girl who, playing around, jumped over a ditch and boing, she became a little boy. She got too hot. Now, I see you looking at me, and I urge you to read Lacour's book because he documents this very carefully. He also documents that the clitoris was not discovered until the 18th century, and I have to tell you, it was by a man, first of all, and his name was Columbus. I'm not making this up. But let's pause with that for a moment. There were some, we love the ancients and they were brilliant, but they were also incredibly wrong about so many things. Aristotle thought that semen was made of brain tissue. Insert joke here. But Lacour's point is that this is not simple scientific error, that there's a power element involved. And let's go on to see what happens next. So in the late 18th and early 19th century, we have an enlightenment in human anatomy in the Western world. We learn something. Women are different from men. In the late 18th and early 19th century, we learn in the Western world that women are different from men. They are not inverted men, too cold to have a penis, or have an exterior penis, excuse me. They are, in fact, different creatures. There is Jacques-Louis Moreau, founder of moral anthropology. You can tell this is going to go well, can't you? He starts to change the paradigm. And remember, he's a reformer because he's going to say that Aristotle, Galen, and all those one-sex model people, they've got it wrong. He says this, not only are the sexes different, they are different in every conceivable aspect of body and soul. Okay, wait a minute. Women are not only different, they're radically different. They're different in their souls. By the way, this is what you get when you have a mythology based on truth and based on absolutes. If it's not one thing, it has to be its binary opposite, right? And so you eliminate the spaces between. Not only are sexes different, they're different in every conceivable aspect of body and soul, in every physical and, wait for it, moral aspect. I love this line. To the physician, says Dr. Moreau, or the naturalist, the relation of woman to man is, quote, a series of oppositions and contrasts. Doctors, now in this new paradigm, claim to be able to identify, quote, the essential features that belong to her, that serve to distinguish her, that make her what she is. All parts, listen to this, all parts of her body present the same differences, and they don't mean that the way it might sound. They mean that there's difference throughout her system. All express woman. The brow. The brow? The nose. Really? The eyes, the mouth, the ears, the chin, the cheeks. If we shift our view to the inside, oh God, please don't. With the help of the scalpel, lay bare the organs, the tissues, the fibers, we encounter everywhere difference. Again, this is a reformed view, a more enlightened view of female anatomy. Patrick Geddes, I love the Victorian era. He was a prominent professor of biology as well as a town planner and a writer on a wide range of social issues. And he uses cellular physiology, such as it was in the Victorian age, to explain the fact that women were, quote, more passive, conservative, sluggish, and stable, unquote, than men, while men are, quote, more active, energetic, eager, passionate, and variable. By now, the mythology is probably starting to sound familiar because we still live in the legacy of this story of Patrick Geddes, who said, quote, what was decided among the prehistoric protozoa cannot be annulled by an act of parliament, unquote. Well, this was supposed to be an improvement. It was certainly an improvement in science, right? Because it got the science right. A vagina is not a penis. Ovaries are not testes. Okay, good, progress. Except, as Angus MacLaren states, the rights of women to sexual pleasure were not enhanced but eroded as an unexpected consequence of the elaboration of more sophisticated models of reproduction. In other words, the advance of the new paradigm only provided more opportunity for the suppression of women, especially women's sexuality. Why? Well, this is LaCour, and this is where he gets criticized. He won't say why, or he'll say too much why. Here's what he says. What caused this? What caused this paradigm shift? The rise of evangelical religion, Enlightenment political theory, the development of new sorts of public spaces in the 18th century, the public sphere, Lockean ideas of marriage as a contract, the cataclysmic possibilities for social change wrought by the French Revolution, the post-revolution conservatism, post-revolutionary feminism, the factory system with its restructuring of the sexual division of labor, the rise of a free market economy, the birth of classes. None of these things caused the making of the new sexed body, he says. Instead, the remaking of the body is itself intrinsic in each of these developments. And if you're hearing the French historian Michel Foucault in that, you're right, because LaCour engages Foucault quite a bit. And we're going to talk about Foucault later on. All right. LaCour's point is that that anatomy serves the interests of ideology. We might say mythology. Same thing for our purposes. Anatomy serves the interests of ideology or mythology. Women's bodies are shaped by culture, but the rhetoric is that of nature, right? So you know that line I read from before. Women are fill in the blank. And it goes the other way. Men are fill in the blank. And if you hear that and it's in the culture, then it's true, right? if everybody around you believes it, until somebody tries to change the paradigm. Sherry Ortner says we haven't changed the paradigm yet. And so her book is called Making Gender. So many of you will know that academics like to distinguish between sex and gender, sex generally being biological, gender being a social construct. Of course, that dichotomy is not going to last. It already has been eliminated by Lacour's book because anatomy is a cultural construct in itself. We saw that in the history of the one-sex model moving to the two-sex model. So Ortner's book, Making Gender, The Politics and Erotics of Culture, is a very different book. I find this fascinating. Lacour is very he's a historian, he's a physician, but he's kind of chatty in his book. He wants to tell you these stories he's come across about gender and sex and women getting pregnant on the verge of death. Ortner is almost Aristotelian in her argument. She's like, okay, here's this, here's that, conclusion, therefore. And so let me take you through it so you can see what she's saying. Her concern, she says, well, let me just quote her here. The secondary status of woman in society is one of the true universals. We can kind of stop right there and pause, right? People talk about universals a lot. I don't talk about universals, but that's another thing just for me. I think you're in trouble as soon as you try to start talking about universals. But if there were a universal, it's probably this. The secondary status of woman in society is one of the true universals, a pan-cultural fact, a fact that is true in all cultures. She acknowledges that within that universal fact, the specific cultural conceptions and symbolizations of woman are incredibly diverse and even mutually contradictory. Further, she says, the actual treatment of women and the relative power and contribution of women vary enormously from culture to culture over different periods of history and spaces on the planet. But both of these points, she says, the universal fact and the cultural variation call for explanation. Here is her point. The universality of female subordination. Now, let me point out that she's not a Platonist here. She's not talking about some universal form. She's an anthropologist. So she's talking about what she observes. And what she observes from reading. She obviously hasn't been to every culture on the planet. But she's coming from an anthropological viewpoint, a qualitative research viewpoint. The universality, and what she sees is the universality of female subordination, the fact that it exists within every type of social and economic arrangement in societies of every degree of complexity, indicates to me that we are up against something very profound, very stubborn, something that cannot be remedied merely by rearranging a few tasks and roles in the social system, nor even by rearranging the entire economic structure. All right, so again, she's very methodical, very philosophical about this. She says there are three levels of this problem of the universal subordination of women. The universal fact, she says, of culturally attributed second-class status to a woman in every society. One is that, and then two questions there are important here. First, what do we mean by this? Good. And what is the evidence? Good. Okay, we're going to be very methodical here. And second, how are we to explain the fact having established it? Secondly, specific ideologies, etc., pertaining to women, which vary widely from culture to culture. The problem at this level, she says, is to account for any particular cultures in terms of factors specific to that culture. And here you might be thinking of matriarchal or female-based or partnership model cultures, which she's going to reject, by the way. She says those never existed. So I don't happen to agree with her there. I don't happen to agree with her sweeping denunciation of it, but this is her point. Her point is she doesn't see it. She doesn't see any society as an anthropologist where women are not subordinate, no matter what the mythology, no matter what the ritual structure, the cultic structure, as we say, no matter what the social structure. She sees no evidence of this. And then thirdly, observable on-the-ground details of women's actual activities, contributions, etc., often at variance with the cultural ideology, but also always constrained within the assumption that women may never officially be preeminent in the system. So she's right here. She should acknowledge that there is such a thing as feminism, that it occurred in the 18th century and perhaps even before, and that it's continued on since then. But her point is that it has not succeeded in overturning the universal truth that women are subordinate in every culture. There's resistance, she would say, but it's never been fully successful. All right. So what is the evidence she's going to look for? 3 types of data. Elements of cultural ideology and informant statement that explicitly devalue women. All right, sure. Symbolic devices, this is important, such as the attribution of defilement. So what she's talking about here are purity laws. And you may know, if you went to Sunday school or temple, that there's a whole lot of language devoted to a menstruating woman who is unclean. Unclean. In fact, she's exiled in these ancient societies because she's unclean. What an odd thing, which we can get into later. But she says she sees it, and she's right. She does see it, again, especially in Western cultures. And third kind of evidence, types of data, social rules that prohibit women from participating in or having contact with some realm of the higher powers of the society, where the higher powers are felt to reside in society. This is very important. Let me say it again. Social rules, you know this, that prohibit women from participating in or having contact with the highest powers of the society, or being silenced when they do. All right. So she concludes in this chapter of her book, the onus is no longer, and by the way, I'm obviously skipping over a bunch of stuff, but she is very methodical and goes through this, discounts matriarchal societies and says this: okay, the onus is no longer upon us to demonstrate that female subordination is a cultural universal. It's up to those who would argue against the point to bring forth counterexamples. I shall take the universal secondary status of women as a given and proceed from there. One explanation for this. Now, remember, that's the next part, is we have to explain the nature, the universal nature of women's subordination. How do we explain this? She says, well, there's one relatively easy answer that's right here, and that is that anatomy is destiny. Women are weaker and therefore subordinate. They're physically weaker. And I'm sure you have heard this, that it's because you don't have as much upper body strength that you can't vote in the 18th century. This is an incredibly stubborn ideology or argument, rhetoric that won't go away. It was used the last time I can remember is during the Republican primary in 2015, when they were talking about whether women could serve in the armed forces, and Newt Gingrich said something about, I don't know, what did he say? Who cares? Menstruation. It was this argument. something about menstruation in the trenches, who knows? But it's this same notion, is that biology is destiny. I think there's plenty of evidence to prove that's wrong. Plus, it's just a poor formulation of an argument. I would bet that many of the women in this audience tonight could do more push-ups than me, because my upper body strength is shit. So again, how do you... So you see, it's not a scientific conclusion, it's an ideological conclusion. It's an ideological justification for what you want to do already. For example, if we valued lower body strength or stamina rather than upper body strength or more acute expressions of strength, who knows what the society would look like. And that, by the way, there's another great book by Judith Lorber. His name the title escapes me right now, but she's really interesting. She talks about how culture shapes women's bodies, and I don't know that this is as true as much anymore, but she talks about how in the previous generation, little girls were taught not to open their legs, to not climb trees, to walk a certain way, to sit a certain way, and she says that forms your body. That's a cultural ideology, a cultural myth, literally shaping the bodies of women. And of course, we could talk about abortion rights too. All right, so Ortner's not going to go there because of all the reasons I've articulated and more. It's not a valid argument at best. It's an ideological, misogynist argument at worst. Worse, she says this is not to say that biological facts are irrelevant. In fact, you'll see, she's going to come back to Simone de Beauvoir, who starts with biology, nor that men or women are not different, but it is to say that these facts and differences have significance only in the framework of culture, of a culturally defined system and values. All right, we're getting through this. She then says, okay, so that answer is not really sound, that women are weaker and therefore they're weaker morally. Remember that line? The differences between women go from anatomy to morality, right? That's a big jump. She said, no, that's not right. What could there be, she says, in the generalized structure and conditions of existence, common to every culture, by the way, she wants to make this universal, that could lead every culture to devalue women? Specifically, she says, my thesis is that woman is being identified with, or if you will, seems to be a symbol of something that every culture devalues. Something that every culture defines, and this is where she loses me. I don't want to say every culture, and I don't want to say universal, but okay, let's hear her point. Something that every culture defines as being at a lower order of existence than itself. There's only one thing that fits this category, she says, and that is nature. Nature. In the most generalized sense, every culture, or generically, in quotation marks, culture, is engaged in the process of generating and sustaining systems of meaningful forms, symbols, ceremonies, etc., by means of which humanity transcends its natural existence, bends its natural existence to its purposes and controls those natural instincts toward its interests, collective interests. We may thus, she says, equate culture broadly with the notion of consciousness, or with the products of human consciousness, systems of thought, technology, religion, by means of which humanity attempts to rise above and assert control, however minimally, over nature. So yes, in fact, the title of this chapter is is woman to nature as man is to culture. Woman, nature, man, culture. Woman needing to be tamed. Woman needing to be transcended for the sake of civilization. And see, now we're right back into what happened during the paradigm shift in the 19th century, is we cannot let woman, this new understanding of woman, that she's actually a different sex, that she's different anatomically, we cannot let that threaten the story that she is part of nature, or at least closer to nature, and therefore not as transcendent as men. Ortner continues, the pan-cultural devaluation of woman could be accounted for quite simply by postulating that woman is being identified with or symbolically associated with nature as opposed to man who is identified with culture. Well, I'm not going to repeat this because I just said it. Why? Why do we think that? We human beings all over the planet, according to Ortner? Because her body and its functions are more involved of the time with species life, seem to place her closer to nature as opposed to men whose physiology frees them more completely in the products of culture. You have to raise children. You have to have children and you have to raise them because we're out building the world. We men. 2, her body and its functions put her in social roles that are in turn considered to be at a lower order of culture in opposition to the higher orders, cooking, domestic life, etc. 3, her traditional social roles imposed because of her body and its functions in turn give her a different, wait for it, psychic structure. So it's not just your body determines your soul. Well, women, not men. Your body determines your soul because you're more like nature. You're too close to nature. Now, she's careful, and she's right not to say this is a simple dichotomy because woman does not equal nature. Women do participate in the functions of culture in terms of those domestic functions. So you're not completely identified with nature. You're just too close to it. Well, you're closer to nature than we are because we build cities and you raise children. Right, but let's not miss her. I think she swings too far for the fences. You don't need to say this is pan-cultural. You don't need to say this is universal to make your point. So what I want us to do is try to see that point, which is, well, that's why I try to keep qualifying it by saying this is Western culture, and I think this is true in Western culture. I don't know of a Western culture, a cultural society that does not have the subjugation of women. Maybe there is, but even if there is, that doesn't, see, if you swing for the universal and you find one counter instance, you're done, your argument's over. Anyway, yeah, thank you. I imagine other people are feeling this too. And other people, including feminists, are not happy with Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, but it's something that Ortner draws upon, and I think it's worth hearing. First of all, de Beauvoir's not going to have any other choice, really any other theory to draw from other than this biology is destiny. She's got to start there to deconstruct it. And I don't know that she does, but later feminists do. Anyway, so de Beauvoir, Simone de Beauvoir, reviews the physiological structure, development, and functions of the human female and concludes this, quote, the female, to a greater extent than the male, is the prey of the species, unquote, the prey of the species. She points out, de Beauvoir, that many areas and processes of a woman's body serve no apparent function for her health and stability. In fact, they're often the source of discomfort, pain, and danger. De Beauvoir says the breasts are irrelevant to personal health. They may be excised at any moments of a woman's life. Quote, many of the ovarian secretions function for the benefit of the egg, promoting its maturation and adapting the uterus to its requirements. In respect to the organism as a whole, they make for disequilibrium rather than for regulation. The woman is adapted to the needs of her egg rather than to her own requirements. Menstruation. Don't think I need to say more. All right, and these processes, de Beauvoir says, that they interrupt a woman's routine, her daily routine, putting her, she says, in a stigmatized state. And that's certainly true in Western cultures, with the menstruating woman as unclean. And in pregnancy, de Beauvoir continues, many of the woman's vitamin and mineral resources are channeled into nourishing the fetus, depleting her own strength and energies. And finally, childbirth itself is painful and dangerous. If Catherine were here, she'd say, doesn't have to be. So, de Beauvoir says this, quote, the female is more enslaved to the species than the male. Her animality is more manifest. And the larger point being, man, and I mean this in a gendered way now, man assures the repetition of life by transcending life. Woman assures the repetition of life simply through nature. She doesn't have to do anything. I'm quoting. If you don't have to do anything, if you're not trapped by your body into in natural processes, then you get freedom and a variety of activities that are uniquely male because you're not tied to continuing the species. Except for his services at the beginning, what the man does is immaterial. Whereas in serving the species, the human male remodels the face of the earth, creates new instruments, he invents, he shapes the future. In other words, the woman's body seems to doom her to mere reproduction. The male, on the other hand, lacking natural creative functions, must assert his creativity externally, artificially, that is, not naturally, through the medium of technology and symbols. And this is de Beauvoir's line that will stick. For it is not in giving life, but in risking life, that man is raised above the animal. That is why superiority has been accorded in humanity, not to the sex that brings forth, but to that which kills. All right, so this is the end of, you may be glad, this is the end of Ortner's argument. Now, and you may be thinking this, and she answers this question if you have it. The culture-nature dichotomy is itself a product of culture. Okay, good. She recognizes that. Nature is a cultural concept. All right.
Is it fair to say that concept originates largely from the Bible?
In the Western world, yes, absolutely. All right, her conclusion. The result is a vicious circle. Various aspects of women's situation, which they have no control over, lead her to be seen as closer to nature, while the view of her as closer to nature is embodied in institutional forms that regenerate this notion. The implications for social change are similarly circular. A different cultural view can grow out only of a different social actuality, but a different social actuality can only grow out of a different cultural view. It's Archimedes trying to move the world. Where does he stand to do so? Women cannot change their bodies, Ortner says. but it seems unlikely that the physiological difference between men and women would be adequate to motivate the devalued view of women were that view not lent further weight by the social and psychological variables discussed above. You've heard of Medusa. Two women are holding a man down on a bed. One presses her fist against his head so he can't raise it from the mattress, while her companion pins his torso in place. They are well built with powerful arms, but even so, it takes their combined strength to keep their victim immobilized as one of them cuts through his throat with a gleaming sword. Blood spurts from the deep red geysers as she saws. She won't stop until his head is fully severed. Her victim's eyes are wide open. He knows exactly what is happening to him. The dying man is Holofernes, an enemy of the Israelites in the Hebrew Bible, and the young woman beheading him is Judith, his divinely appointed assassin. Yet at the same time, he is also an Italian painter named Agostino Tassi, while the woman with the sword is Artemisia Gentileschi, who painted this. It is effectively a self-portrait. "This is the ring you gave me, and these are your promises," yelled Gentileschi as she was tortured in a Rome courtroom in 1612. Ropes around her fingers were wrapped around her fingers and pulled tight. The judge had advised the moderate use of the Sibylle, as this was called, for she was, after all, 18. Across the court sat the man who had raped her. No one thought of torturing him. Defiantly, Gentileschi told him that her thumb screws were the wedding ring he'd promised her. Again and again, she repeated that her testimony about the rape was reliable. "It is true. It is true. It is true. It is true." Tassi had tricked his way into her room and started making unwanted offers of sex, she testified. "He then threw me onto the edge of the bed, pushing me with a hand on my breast, and he put a knee between my thighs to prevent me from closing them. Lifting my clothes, he placed a hand with a handkerchief on my mouth to keep me from screaming." She fought back. "I scratched his face," she told the court, "and pulled his hair, and before he penetrated me again, I grasped his penis so tight that I removed a piece of flesh." But she couldn't stop him. Afterwards, she rushed to a drawer and got out a knife. "I'd like to kill you with this knife because you have so dishonored me," she shouted. He opened his coat and said, "Here I am." Gentileschi threw the knife, but he shielded himself. "Otherwise," she said, "I might have killed him." That is an article from The Guardian on this amazing painting by Jonathan Jones that was so well rendered. I thought I would just read it to you. Medusa, the story of a woman too powerful that she must be beheaded. Gentileschi, a woman who was raped and turned it into art. Mary Beard, Women in Power, a Manifesto. You cannot, which is in the bookstore, by the way, you cannot easily fit women into a structure that is already coded as male. See LaCour, Thomas, Ortner, Sherry. You have to change the structure. That means thinking about power differently. It means decoupling it from public prestige. It means thinking collaboratively about the power of followers, not just of leaders. It means, above all, thinking about power as an attribute or a verb to power, not as a possession. And if you think Medusa is not relevant, look closely at that image. Mary Beard again, quote, "It is also true that one satiric stunt on U.S. television featured a fake severed head of Trump himself, but in that case, the female comedian who was concerned lost her job. By contrast, this scene of Perseus Trump brandishing the dripping, oozing head of Medusa Clinton was very much a part of the everyday domestic American world. You could buy it on t-shirts and tank tops, coffee mugs, laptop sleeves, and tote bags with the logo Triumph, or sometimes Trump. It may take a moment or two to take in that normalization of gendered violence, but if you were ever doubtful about the extent to which the exclusion of women from power is culturally embedded, or unsure of the continued strength of classical ways, I might say mythological ways, of formulating it and justifying it well, I give you Trump and Clinton, Perseus and Medusa, and I rest my case. And as many of you have heard in here before, the wonderful essay by Hélène Cixous, the French feminist, who says in her essay, The Laugh of the Medusa, you only have to look at Medusa straight on to see her, and she's not deadly. She's beautiful, and she's laughing. Thank you.